because still today there are Holocaust survivors in Israel that are hungry.
Since the end of World War II, the German government has paid $78.4 billion in compensation and reparations to the survivors of Holocaust and Nazi persecution, but not directly. The funds had to go through Israel. Now new reports have shed light on what Israel did with the funds. Rather than going straight to the hands of the surviving victims, the Israeli regime has collected most of the cash, and many of the surviving victims claim that they have not been fairly compensated as promised. Israel uses funds to build an industrial base for buying and producing arms, with a small amount going to survivors, leaving many deeply damaged people without proper support. Israel claims that there are over 189,000 Holocaust survivors. Over 50,000 Holocaust survivors live below the poverty line without proper help from the regime. Even after the Holocaust, survivors are still struggling to pay for necessities such as housing and medicine. Holocaust survivor Eva Kovalenko is 80 years old and cares for her sick husband Ivan. Eva believes that Israeli authorities don't do enough for people who survived the Holocaust.
Мне непонятно, почему для таких, даже как мы, переживших Холокост, не делают такое.
Eva, who was a refugee from Europe before coming to Israel on hopes of a better life, would now even settle for a hostel room just to survive.
Если бы у нас была крыша над головой, как говорится, мы даже не просим социальное жилье, просто хостель, чтобы мы уже достойно прожили, как говорится, свою старость.
Holocaust victims depend on private organizations seeking new funds from foreign governments in Europe to help aid Holocaust victims. Earlier this year, the US-based Claims Conference increased Holocaust survivors' funding by $87 million, enough to only compensate for a few thousand survivors. Coletta Avital is a former lawmaker in the Israeli parliament. She also heads an umbrella organization of Israeli Holocaust survivors. Avital says that Holocaust victims are just not receiving enough from the regime itself.
People are getting sicker, and they do get pensions, some of them from Germany, some of them from the State of Israel, but whatever they get is not sufficient.
Avital believes that the regime in Israel should be more responsible.
The government used to say, look, we are not guilty of the Holocaust. It's the Germans that should pay. My answer to that was, you're certainly not guilty, but you're responsible for your own citizens.
In recent years, protests like this spark in Israel every now and then. These demonstrators are demanding that the regime tell them where the money that Germany has been allocating for them as Holocaust survivors went.
Other countries like Germany gave us the money in order to give it to the people who survived the Holocaust, and we maintain it here. I don't know, maybe in Bank of Israel, I don't know where it is, but it's here. And yes, this is my claim. Just take it out of your safe and give it to the people. And don't mess with how long have you been in the concentration camp. It's not an issue. You've been through the Holocaust in Germany or in other countries. You deserve it. That's it.
Holocaust survivors believe that the nearly $80 billion in reparations Germany paid to Israel should have gone to the survivors. Aside from that, they complain that Israel can't even help them as they age without much needed income.
Holocaust survivors being treated in Israel have difficulties in surviving because there are old people, probably with quite a lot of sickness, and they have not enough income to cover also medicines and also food. So there are some of the Holocaust survivors that are not well. I am 88 years old. Now, we can say that most of the Holocaust survivors today that lived through the Holocaust from 1939 till 45 are old people. Some are 90, some are 85, some are 88. You don't expect from those people to work. And we all know that Germany has sent the money. What happened with the money, I don't know. What I know and what I feel and what I will always say is that the Israeli government did not treat the Holocaust survivors as they should, because they did get quite a lot of money. But this is what I can say. There are numbers which you can get anywhere, how much a Holocaust survivor gets. For instance, I, who am 67% invalid because I got 2 bullets in the back, I get 3,000 shekel in a month. That is all, and that is very high, very high. So it's difficult to live out of 3,000, but they are like me. God was good to me. I needed it, but there are Holocaust survivors that have a tough time to live in Israel or anywhere else, from 3,000 shekel in a month. I was asked by the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, to come and sit down with him because he wanted to know from me, what do you expect from the government of Israel to do? He was very nice, very understanding, but being an Israeli and reading the papers, I understand that he didn't do much, because still today there are Holocaust survivors in Israel that are hungry. And that is a statement from the government of Israel, not mine. I don't know people that are hungry. I read it in the papers. And if you ask me, whoever, that is a shame of this government, the other government, all other governments, because they got for every Holocaust survivor, including me, money. And that money was used for different things.
1 out of every 5 surviving Holocaust victim had been forced to choose between food and other necessities due to financial insecurity, according to a survey by the Foundation for the Benefit of Holocaust Victims in Israel. The same survey notes that 60% of Holocaust survivors are worried about their financial situation. Furthermore, the survey also highlights that a whopping 84% believed that the treatment of Holocaust survivors in Israel after World War II to present day is not good. We asked Israelis on the streets of Tel Aviv what they think about the lack of financial aid from the regime in Tel Aviv to Holocaust victims. Here's what they replied.
So I say personally, I guess I feel a bit disgraced. I mean, because the money is there and the people are still alive. So where is the money if you think about it? Because in 10, 20 years, I think it won't be possible to house them anymore. So for me, as a family of a Holocaust survivor, personally, I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed because this is our history. I mean, we're all Jewish. This is a Jewish land. And I wish it will be different.
Someone needs to find out, where did all the money go to? Where is that money? I mean, it didn't disappear. It's got to be somewhere. And now we don't have time to really deal right now with the money that's missing, but to do now what can be done today.
I guess the money didn't go to the Holocaust survivors because it's still under the poverty line, and it's still continuing because it is something that just moved on. So it's just sad.
But as far as I know, and as far as we can tell, the money has been misused because the government took the money to do things for the country, which is in one hand good, but in the other hand it's not good because the survivors that needs that money didn't receive it, and they need to have they need to come first. They need to be the first priority always because they are old. None of them are going to live forever.
For years, the issue of missing funds that were meant for Holocaust victims has embarrassed Israel. After all, the regime bases its foundations on those very same victims. But as the Holocaust survivors age, their calls to live with dignity and welfare are only becoming more silent.
when they